This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
It was a privilege to meet him several years ago. I'm in his kehillah when I came out there to speak on behalf of Hashavua. And since then, Baruch Hashem, he's been a mayin gaber, giving many, hundreds of shiurim on behalf of the program. And it's a pleasure to have him be ma'an us with Divrei Torah tonight, Leil Rabbi.
Okay, Bruchim Abam, thank you so much, Rabbi Gottesman, for the warm introduction. And Shalom Aleichem to the Olam that came tonight for this program, L'Kavod, the Daf Hashavua, and for the listeners who Es Asher Yeshnoi Kan, Es Asher Einenu Kan. Tonight I would like to speak about a subject which is Noigeya, the Daf Hashavua, as well as the Yom Tov of Hoshana Rabbah. Tonight we say, for those who say the Ushpizin, tonight we say, B'matu Minach David. Tonight's special visitor, tonight's special guest, is none other than David Malka Mashiach, David Hamelech. So perhaps we could explain a little bit the connection between David Hamelech and Hoshana Rabbah, and somehow tie this into Masechta Yevamos. What does David Hamelech have to do with Masechta Yevamos? So let's begin. We know that Masechta Yevamos is the first Masechta in Seder Nashim. So the Achroinim ask, most notably the Maserei Kach, Rabbi Lezer of Amsterdam, in his commentary to the Mishnah, he wants to know, look, this is Seder Nashim. One would have expected that the proper way to open Seder Nashim would be Masechta Kedushin, Masechta Ksubis. Yibum is sort of, you would think, is most of the Shchicha. It's not really a very common case. It's not really a typical scenario. And Bechlal, the only way to have Yibum is if it's first set up with a Kedushin and a Ksuba. So one would have expected Yevamas to be at the tail end of Seder Nashim, but why would Rabbi Dafka begin Seder Nashim with Masechta Yevamas? That's the question of the Maserei Kach. And he says further, why name the Masechta Yevamas, plural? Why plural? Say Yavam. And why Lashon Nekeva? Why Yevamas? Why not Yevamim? These are the questions of the Maserei Kach. In other words, this is a very atypical case. This is not a very frequent situation. It should be the end of Nashim. Why do we call it Yevamais after the Yevama, Lashon Nekeva, and why plural? So the Maserei Kach says something very interesting. The Maserei Kach says that Rabbi, who redacted the Mishnah, the Gemara in Shabbos says on Daf Nun Vav, Rabbi da'asa mi David kadarish b'schusa de David. Rabbi is always looking and always searching to try to come up with some kind of limud zchus and some kind of hisnatzlus and defense for his great ancestor and the patriarch of the Davidic dynasty, none other than David himself. So Rebbe was always looking to be mechabed David Hamelech. Okay, now, says the Maserei Kach, the entire Malchus Beis David was built on the institution of Yibum. For example, Yehuda told his sons, Bana al Eishes Achicha. And as the Ramban explains, that even though the mitzvah Yibum was not given, and even though when it would be given, it would specifically be given to the one's brother's wife, nevertheless, the mitzvah was expanded back in the day to redeem any relative who passed away without children. And ultimately, the marriage and the union of Yehuda and Tamar was a union of Yibum. So what produced the Malchus Beis David was none other than the institution of Yibum. Furthermore, says the Maserei Kach, aside from Yehuda and Tamar, there was another great Yavam and Yevama, not only Yehuda and Tamar, but there was another great situation of Yibum, namely Bayaz and Rus. So Malchus Beis David was built on two situations, two matzavim of Yibum, namely Yehuda and Tamar and Rus and Bayaz. And therefore, says the Maserei Kach, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, who came from David, started Seder Nashim, L'chabedes Malchus Beis David, L'chabedes his ancestor, with Yivamais, because the entire Malchus Beis David is built on Yivam, and not only Yivam in general, but two specific cases of Yivam, Yehuda and Tamar, and Rus and Boaz, and that is why it is called Yivamais, plural, referring to those two situations, and really referring to those two Nashim, because in both situations, it wasn't the man who was most interested in being Mekayim the mitzvah, but in both situations, certainly Tamar and Rus as well, they were the ones who were proactive, they were the ones who went out of their way in order to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibam. That is why Seder Nashim begins with Yivamais, reference to Rus and Boaz, Yehuda and Tamar. In fact, says the Maser Rekeach, the word Yivamais is a Rashi Tevos. Yud is Yehuda, Beis is Boaz. The Vav Taf, we're going to start with the Taf. Taf is Tamar. Taf, says Maser Kech, is the last letter of Rus. So you already have all the four players in the words Yivamas. You have Yehuda, you have Boaz, you have Tamar, you have Rus. And then the Mem is the middle letter of Tamar, and the Vav is the middle letter of Rus. Says the Maser Kech, the word Yivamais is a code word to capture all four great builders of the Malchus Beis David. So you thought you were going to hear a shir about Daf Hashavua Yivamais? No, tonight we're going to learn about Malka de Mashiach David Hamelech, whose entire essence is built on the concept of Yibam and on the word Yivamais, Rashi Tevos, Yehuda, Boaz. Mem is the middle letter of Tamar, Vav the middle letter of Rus, Taf, first letter of Tamar, last letter of Rus. And then the Maser Rekech says a whopper. He says, if you take the gematria, the numerical value of the first letter of all 16 prakim of Yevamos. I know you probably did this on your own time and you know it by now, but in case you never calculated this, let me just share with you. If you take the gematria of the first letter of all 16 prakim of Yevamos, you get 370. Plus, you take the 16 prakim, that's 386, gematria David ben Yishai. So if you want to know what is Yevamos all about, it's all about Malchus Beis David, and that's what we discussed tonight. That's what tonight's subject is, Hoshana Rabbah, the night of David HaMelech. If I could share with you perhaps then an original approach as to why Rabbi Yehuda Anasi began Seder Nashim with Masechta Yevamos, aside from the idea that the whole Malchus Beis David is built on Yibam, and that is an idea I stumbled across in the writings of Reb Chaim Falaji in the Sefer Nefesh Chaim. Reb Chaim Falaji in Mareches Habez, Ois Yirches. Reb Chaim Falaji says, if we would have to give an analogy of what the building of the third Beis Hamikdash is like, and God's redemption of the Jewish people in the future, in other words, if we had to give an example of some kind of procedure or protocol in Yiddishkeit, of what we could compare the Gula Asida to, what we could compare the future redemption to, says of Chaim Falaji, the Geula Shlema of Klal Yisrael is nothing other than Yibum, where God is our Yavam and we are the Yavama. Says of Chaim Falaji, that is because we are always Zakuk Ta'akadosh Baruch Hu. Don't make a mistake and think maybe Chas v'Shalom we're like a Grusha, or we're like an Almana. No, we're only Ki Almana. But we're like an Almana that's Zakuk to a Yavam, says Reb Chaim Falaji. And the Ribbon Shalom's redemption of Klal Yisrael is Mamish, the Yibum of Klal Yisrael. And the Binyan Bayis HaShlishi, says Reb Chaim Falaji, Binyan HaBayis La'asid Lavoi Hu B'makoim Yibum Keinira Midivrei Hazayar HaKadosh. And then he says, Yesh Lumaid Da'anachnu Ma'kadosh Baruch Hu Yesh Lanu Din Yibum Sha'anachnu Amnei Yisrael Ki Yavama V'loi Nasan Lanu Chalitza. God never severed the Zika, but we are always attached to Him. We are always zakuk to Him. We're always connected to Him. And perhaps then, because Yibum is really the analogy of our redemption, maybe that's the reason why the whole binyan of Malchus Beis David is banoi on Yibum, because Yibum is really the analogy of our Geula, and perhaps this is why Yibum was so chaviv to Rabbi, who came from the Malchus Beis David, and he put Yevamos as the first Masechta Nashim, as this Masechta is really the paradigm of the Gula HaSida. So let me share with you an interesting question, now that we're on the subject of David Hamelech, regarding the status of David, and then we'll segue a little bit into Hoshana Rabbah. We just did Daf Chaf. When I was in yeshiva, Daf Chaf was, I think, the most oft-quoted blot in Masechta Yevamos. Chayvei Lavin. Why don't you do Chayvei Lavin? Why don't you do Yibum to Chayvei Lavin? Why don't you say Aseh Doichalo Isaseh? I want to share with you an amazing question about none other than David Hamelech. You know the Gemara Yevamos Ayin Vavam and Beis. The Gemara discusses that when David Hamelech went out to fight Goliath, and miraculously he put on the armor and it fit him perfectly, and Shaul was getting a little nervous. How could this gentleman put on my armor? How does my armor fit him? And the Shaul started to ask, is he from Paras? Is he from Zarach? Does he have royal lineage? And we know Doye kicked in. Hey, instead of asking whether he's from Paras or Zarach, and whether he's royal or Melucha, you should ask a much more fundamental question. You should ask, can he come, is he royal Lavoi Bekahal? Is he worthy to come and join the Jewish people as a kosher member of Klal Yisrael? After all, his ancestry is from Moav, and it says, Loyavoi Moavi Bekal Hashem, and Avner got involved, and other Chachamim got involved, and they said, what do you mean? The reason why Moav is disqualified is because they should have greeted Klal Yisrael with food and water, and it's not modest for the women to have been expected to do that. And the taina back to that Doyeg said was, well, why didn't the women serve food and drink to the women? And ultimately, the Gemara says, Kol kvuda basmelech panima, and back and forth. Do we say only a mamzer is asur, or mamzeres also, mitzri v'loi mitzris? Do we say kol kvuda basmelech panima? Do we not say kol kvuda basmelech panima? Until a man by the name of Yeser got up, and he girded his sword like a Yishmaeli, and he says, Kach mekoblani mi beis dino shel Shmuel haramasi, amoni v'lei amonis mayavi v'lei mayavis. That's the Gemara. Basically, nobody really had a clear tradition until this gentleman by the name of Yeser said, anybody who disagrees with me, I'm going to kill you. By the way, that would effectively end the dispute. That usually works. And but nobody else really had a clear tradition, except for Yeser from the Bezdin of Shmuel. So the Pasha Kasha here. It is a Kasha addressed by the Marsha. And it's addressed by the Chassam Sofer and the Drashas. What are we drumming up? The Bezdin of Shmuel Haramasi. Wasn't there a man by the name of Boaz? Boaz was no mediocre Talmud Chacham. Boaz was a shofet. He's a Gadol Hadar. Ivtzan was a shofet. I have a question. If there's any problems with Ammon and Moav, then what do we need a tradition from Bezdin or Shmuel Haramasi? Boaz was Miyabim Rus. So clearly, it's Amoni v'lei Amonis, Mayavi v'lei Mayavis. What do we need to go to some tradition from the Beis Din of Shmuel Ramasi? Why can't we take an ironclad proof from Maisa Boaz? Boaz lived with Rus. What's the whole machlokes? What's Doyeg's taina? Didn't Doyeg know what Boaz did? I mean, Doyeg was a great Talmud Chacham, but what about Boaz? That's the Kasha of the Marsha. Says the Marsha, an amazing answer. Really, I'll tell you that not only could you not marry someone from Ammon and Moav, you can't marry Ammonis and a Moavis. How could Boaz be Miyabim Rus? You know how? The Kasha of the Gemara on Daf Chaf. Asei doicha lois asei. Boaz did Yibum because asei doicha lois asei. How did he continue living with her? Taka, Boaz held that Bia Shnia was Asur. So that means you're going to say that he never had Bia Shnia? He did it anyway. We know Boaz dropped dead right after Bia Rishona. Boaz didn't survive the night. But Avada Boaz would not have had Bia Shnia. The Boaz held the reason why that Aseh is Doicha Lois Aseh. And taka be'etzem you could do yibum techayve lavin al tzasei doichaloi sasei, and biyashnia would have been aser, and Boaz wouldn't have done biyashnia. But the Gemara says we're geyser biyashnia to biyarishayna. Says the Maharsha, the time of Boaz they didn't make the gzera yet, so Boaz was allowed to do yibum. So we can't take any proof from Boaz's yibum terus because Boaz did yibum terus. Even if Moyavis is aser, al tzasei doichaloi sasei. That is the cheshbon of the Maharsha. The Chassam Sofer in his drashos points out that this, the act of Boaz can only be dismissed through aseh doichaloi sasei, according to the Chachamim, that the primary mitzvah is Yibam. But if you're going to say, like Abba Shol and Daf Lamed Tes in Yevamos, that Chalitza is the preferred mitzvah, then you cannot utilize aseh doichaloi sasei for Yibam. And then the act of Boaz could be drawn as conclusive evidence that Amoini v'loi Amoinis Mayavi l'Mayavis, and we wouldn't have to come on to the tradition of Shmuel Haramasi. But tonight, Rabbi Yisai, is the night of David Hamelech. Today is the Yeshpizin of David Hamelech. And let's just explain B'nagel in Yonenu and the amazing institution of Daf Hashavua, the particular connection between David and Hoshana Rabbah. Reb Shlomo Kluger has an amazing question, and I'll try to say this mamish bekitzer. I don't want to run into anybody else's man. But Reb Shlomo Kluger wants to know, look, we have a Yom Kippur, so what do we need Hoshana Rabbah for? I mean, was there anything missing on our Yom Kippur that we need to have another Yom Hadin? So Reb Shlomo Kluger says a wondrous yesod. He says we need two Yomei Hadin. We need Yom Kippur and Hoshana Rabbah. We need one day to be mechaper for the Yomim. Yom Kippur is mechaper b'yoim, because Yom Kippur is mechaper for the sins of the day. And Hoshana Rabbah, the Ikar Avodah of Hoshana Rabbah is B'layla, because Hoshana Rabbah is mechaper on one's nighttime. Interestingly, Rav Shlomo Kluger says that the reason the Torah doesn't really talk about Hoshana Rabbah is because back in the day, most sins were done during the day. What kind of averos could you do at night? You know, the lights go off and there's nothing to do, so people went to sleep, so there were hardly any sins at night, and therefore the Torah doesn't really need to discuss Hoshana Rabbah. But to my mind, this might explain the great momentum that Hoshana Rabbah has gained over the last couple of years. When I was a kid, Hoshana Rabbah, who knew anything about Hoshana Rabbah? Today, Hoshana Rabbah has picked up a lot of steam. Hoshana Rabbah has become a very popular day. And maybe in light of these comments of Rav Shlomo Kluger, we understand, because back in the day, nobody sinned at night, so Hoshana Rabbah was relegated to a subject that was not as significant. I think we would all acknowledge that Bizman Hazeh in 2020, in Tavshin Pei Aleph, I think the tide has changed. I think it's safe to say most averos today are done at night. Toshes choshech v'hi laila by sirmos kol chayse aretz. I think it's safe to say ruba of the avonos v'chataim. Now people are able to do b'laila. Hence, the added importance and significance and momentum that Hoshana Rabbah has picked up as Dvarim Gedolim Einam B'Mikra. So perhaps today Hoshana Rabbah has never been more important, and of probably the most important thing we need to think about is the way we spend our nights, Bittul Torah, because with the advent of technology, we have so many things that can so easily waste our time, and therefore Hoshana Rabbah is the evening to start to think how we could better utilize our nights. As the Rambam tells us, that somebody who wants to be Koine Keser Shel Torah should take advantage of all of his evenings, and he shouldn't waste them b'shena, b'achila, b'shtia. And the Rambam says, ukeyoytze bay. And I always think those words, ukeyoytze bay, include more possibilities than probably any two words that were ever written by anybody. The number of things that you could waste your nights with that are included in the words ukeyoytze bay is really what should be foremost on our minds. So I want to share with you one machshava. We know that David Hamelech, the Medrash says, was destined to live 3 hours. And Adam Rishon saw there's this little child who's destined to live 3 hours, and he said, God, can I give him a present? Rebbe Shem said, why not? And Adam bequeathed 70 years to the life of Adam Harishon. This is a well-known Medrash. In fact, the Medrash in Nasai says, Shivim shekel b'shekel HaKodesh corresponds to the 70 years that Adam Harishon gave David HaMelech. And therefore Adam, instead of living ki yomer shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu 1,000 years, he only lived 930. But there's an incredible Zohar in Parshas Vayishlach. And the Zohar says that, you know where David HaMelech got 70 years from? When he said, Chayim sha'al mimeni ve'atein lach? He got it from the Avos HaKadoshim. Namely, Avram Avinu was supposed to live 175 years. And instead, we know Hashem took him away 5 years early, so he shouldn't see Esav going Latar Basra. Avraham gave 5 years to David HaMelech, the Zohar says. Yitzchak did not give everything because the Zohar says Yitzchak comes misitra de choshech, and David comes from that sitra, and he couldn't give him years, and whatever that means, that's above my pay grade. Yaakov, says the Zohar, lived 147 years. He could have lived like Avram Avinu, 175. So he was nifter 28 years early. What happened to those 28 years? He gave them to David. So Avraham gave 5 years, and Yaakov gave 28 years, a total of 33. Then comes along Yosef HaTzadik, who lived 110 years. He should have lived 147 like Yaakov. What happened to his 37 years? Says the Zohar, he gave it to David. That's where David got his 70 years from. David got 5 years from Abraham, 28 years from Yaakov, because Yaakov should have lived 175, 37 years from Yosef. Ask the Zohar how yitachen that Yosef gave 37 years more than Abraham and Yaakov combined. Well, that's why he's called a tzaddik, says the Zohar. He was so magnanimous that he gave more generously than Abraham and Yaakov combined. So that's where David got 70 years. 5 from Abraham, 28 from Yaakov, and 37 from Yosef. V'kan haben shoyal. Wait a second. Didn't David get 70 from Adam Harishon? And furthermore, if he did, he should have lived 140 years. And this is a very interesting question. Who in fact gave David his 70 years? Was it Adam? Or was it Abraham, Yaakov, and Yosef? And this question is addressed by the Sefer Or Hachama of Rabbi Avram Galante, who wants to say, well, Adam tried to give him 70 years, but after he sinned with the Eitz Hadas, the 70 years were nifkam, and he couldn't give them anymore, so he had to get 70 years from the Avos. This question is addressed by the Ben Yehoyada in Masechta Shabbos Daf Lamed, who basically says that Adam Harishon retracted, and he took it back. In fact, the Shlach Kadosh in his commentary to the Siddur reads this into the Psukim. Al tiftechu v'nadivim beven Adam. Don't trust generous people. Don't trust Adam, who wanted to give 70 years. Tashev rucha yashav li'ad masai. Because at the end of his life, Adam wanted it back. Instead, trust the Avos asher shekel Yaakov v'Yezroi, says the Shlach. But there's an amazing approach by the Chida, which is most relevant to this evening. And that is, the Chida writes in the Midbar Kedemos that in fact, who gave David the 70 years? Was it Adam or was it the Avos? And he answers, yes, they both did. So then, why didn't David live 140 years? And says the Chida, yes, he did live 140 years. How's that? Because David HaMelech never slept. David HaMelech said, look, if I sleep during the night, I will live 140 years. But David HaMelech said, Ma ahavti Torah kol hayom hisichasi. How I love the Torah. And if I love the Torah so much, not only b'yom hisichasi, kol hayom hisichasi. I once heard from Rav Pinchas Friedman, the Shvilei Pinchas, like in the Haggadah, kol yemei chayecha l'rabbis haleilos, kol hayom hisichasi. David HaMelech says all day, not only b'yoyim, but b'layla as well. Says the Chidah. David lived 140 years, 70 years during the daytime, 70 years during the nighttime, because David did not sleep. Shita nishmin. David never slept. Loi b'yoyim, v'loi b'layla. So he lived 140 years, but they were condensed into 70. 70 years of daytime he got from Adam. 70 years of nighttime he got from Abraham, Yaakov, and Yosef. David literally shortened his life by 70 years because he loved Torah so much. What does David represent? David is the paragon of Limud HaTorah B'Layla, of learning at night, ad kedei kach, that he jeopardized years of his life because ma havti Torasecha kol hayom hisichasi. David is the semel of Limud HaTorah B'Layla. Chatzois Laila Akum Lach Hoides L'chal Mishpatetzikecha. David arose every midnight to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to engage in Limud HaTorah. David is the semel, the paragon of Limud B'Layla. And therefore, we could suggest, based on Rav Shlomo Kluger, where the tachlis of Hoshana Rabbah is Yom Kippur's mechaper on the Yomim, Hoshana Rabbah's mechaper on the Leilos, and V'rosh V'rishain, what we need to think about is how we utilize our Leilos. So who better to represent the koyach of Hoshana Rabbah than Adonenu David, who is the semel of Limud HaTorah, not only b'yoyim, but kol hayom hisichasi. And certainly, those of us who are zocheh to be part of this great movement, Daf Hashavua, I think one of the greatest benefits that it gives us is, at least every evening we have on our radar that did we learn the blat? Did we review the blat? Did we learn with Rashi? Did we take the test? Did we chap a toisis? Did we chap a makom Iyun? And the enjoyment of having a blad and reviewing it again and again and again. I once heard from Rabbi Victor Miller, Zechatzak Levracha, Torah is nimshala lelechem. Torah is like bread. Why? In one dimension, because bread is a starch. The more you chew the bread, the more your saliva activates the sugary starches, the sweeter it becomes. The longer you chew, if you swallow the bread too early, you lose some of the taste. The more you chew, the sweeter it becomes. And that's what we see in the Daf HaShavua. The more we review the blat, the sweeter it becomes, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth time. So I always like to say, it's really Daf Yomi, but in Daf Yomi, you could learn the Shas 7 times in 49 years. But you could also learn like this. It's not so hard to learn every blot 7 times. So at the end, you could come out learning it even more times in 49 years. So we should be zoiche through the hashpa of the Yom Tov of Sukkos, which the Sukkah, Rabbi Mechai says, is merames to Iyun HaTorah, and through Hoshana Rabbah, through the koyach of David HaMelech, should be mechazik in our limudim, and we should be zoichet that the simcha of Sukkos and simcha of Simchas Torah should carry us on throughout the year. And Rabbi Gottesman, the last time I saw you was a shiur on Shmini Atzeres, I think a couple years ago when we first started the daf in our shul. We were zoichet to hear a shiur from you on the Iyun of Shmini Atzeres. So, and on that note, we take leave on the same subject. And thank you so much for hosting me tonight. And bracha v'hatzlacha, and a good Yom Tov. Piska Tava. Amen. Thank you.
Sheer combination of Agada and a tribute to the one-day Daf Hashavua. But to conclude tonight's program,
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.